Good morning, Riverfront family. I'm happy to be with all of you this morning. We are diving in this morning talking about our Pathways series. So if you've been around for the past couple weeks, you know that we are a few weeks into a series where we are talking about 6 different pathways or 6 different streams to connect to God. And all 6 of these pathways can be found in the life and in the teachings of Jesus Christ. So it's really important to note that they're all rooted in that. And each of them are important and are needed for balance in our spiritual lives. But some are going to resonate more with us than others. And so it's not like some are right and some are wrong or some are better than others. Each of us are different and each of us are wired to connect with God in a different way. And so as we've heard of a few different spiritual pathways, and as we continue to explore these different pathways, we might find that we have a dominant stream that we identify with. Even though we have a dominant one that we may identify with, we will also each most likely find multiple streams that have shaped us, maybe based on the family we grew up in or how we were taught to connect with God. And we will find multiple streams that continue to form us today. It's not like just a one stream thing. And I think there's something that we can each get from each of the streams. You know, humans don't fit into little boxes. So it's not like you'll pick one of these 6 and that's your stream. They all have something to offer us, even though we might find we resonate with one more than the others. So I'm going to give you a reminder of what the 6 pathways are. We've done a few of them already. So we've done the contemplative pathway. Michael talked about the social justice pathway. Pastor Ben last week talked about the charismatic pathway. Today, I'm going to be talking about the holiness pathway. And then in the next 2 weeks, we'll be talking about the incarnational and the evangelical. So today we're talking about the holiness pathway. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the incarnational pathway too, because I think these two are really related. But holiness is what we're talking about today. So I don't know about you, but when I first hear the word holy, I think of 2 things. I think of God, who is holy, and I also think of people who think that they are better than other people, right? Maybe people who are holier than thou. You know, that's not really a compliment. Or like, oh, aren't you holy? Holy probably wouldn't be the top of the list of adjectives of people that I would want to be friends with. Like, you're not looking for holy people necessarily to be friends with. Well, maybe some of you are. If you are, good for you. But we think of holier than thou people, and that's actually not what the idea of holiness is about at all biblically. So cast these predispositions or thoughts about this word out, cast them out of your brain, and let's reimagine the word holiness this morning. So biblically, holiness is focusing upon the inward reformation of the heart and the development of holy habits. So Richard Foster says, holiness is a lifelong process of being transformed. It is the heart of discipleship, the heart of desiring to be transformed and to become more like Jesus. So kind of like spiritual formation, which those of us who are in huddles are currently participating in. Holiness is not rules. It is not regulations. It is not a single standard of behavior. Holiness is sustained attention to the heart and to the source of our actions. It focuses on the formation and transformation of this center, our center. Holiness is not, it's not otherworldliness. It is world affirming. World affirming. It's the here and now. Holiness sees the sacredness of all things. Holiness is not asceticism. It is a bodily spirituality. A bodily spirituality, which is why I said we're going to also talk a little bit about incarnation today, even though that's next week. Holiness affirms the goodness of the human body and seeks to bring it into working harmony with our spirit. Holiness means that things are working well, that our body and our spirit are working together in harmony. Holiness gives us our truest and our fullest humanity. In holiness, we become the persons we were created to be, made in the image of Jesus and made in the image of God. When it is misinterpreted, holiness can look like legalism. Baptists have certainly fallen into this category a few too many times. Certain Baptists have said, you can't drink or you can't dance or whatever it may be, have made arbitrary boundaries and rules. Maybe you grew up with this type of holiness. I know I grew up with it to some extent. Don't have sex before marriage, don't do drugs, don't drink alcohol, don't watch certain types of movies with certain content, whatever it might be. And legalism is not holiness. Legalism comes when we define what it means to be holy, and then we have a list to measure if we or if other people are achieving it. And in the midst of that, we forget about the truth that holiness comes through one source, and that is God. It doesn't come from refraining from anything or doing anything. It comes from God and God alone. But holiness, when misplaced, it can look like legalism. It can also, when it's misinterpreted, look like perfectionism. Are any of you perfectionists? I can be sometimes. I can be critical and kind of err towards the side of perfectionism. And when we think of holiness as perfectionism, we forget that it is a process of transformation. So it's not about being perfect. It's not about getting something right. It's the process. It's like what I tell my kids all the time when we're doing math or something particularly tricky. I say it's okay to make a mistake. It's not about getting the right answer. It's not about being perfect. It's about the process of learning, of making our brain stronger, of working through tricky things, even if we're making mistakes. That's what holiness is about. It's not about perfection or perfectionism. It is freeing our bodies from the things that block our connection with God and with God's people. In Romans 12, which we just read this morning, Paul uses this image of sacrifice and an altar. He says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Offer your bodies as a sacrifice. I've been thinking a lot about our bodies this week because I'm reading this great book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. Maybe some of you have read it. If you're in my huddle, I apologize in advance because you've had to hear me talk about this book twice in 1 week. Apparently, if I get on a kick about something, I'm going to go full into that kick. So again, apologies to the 5 or 6 of you who have already had to listen to Pastor Liza go on and on about this book. But the author, Resmaa Menakem, talks about his maternal grandmother, and that's what the book is named after, My Grandmother's Hands. And he talks about how both trauma and resilience were expressed through her body, through his grandmother's body. He says she was a small woman, but she had very thick, stubby fingers, and they were the result of picking cotton as a sharecropper's daughter, beginning when she was 4 years old. He said cotton plants have burrs in them that will cut you wide open. Eventually, her hands adapted to the repeated trauma in a way that protected her. But her hands looked odd, almost deformed as a result. My grandmother loved us with her whole heart. But like so many Americans, she had a lot of trauma stored where? In her body. In her body. And she passed on some of that trauma, as well as her love and as well as her resilience, to her children and to her grandchildren. And so this book, My Grandmother's Hands, it's about our bodies. It's about our human bodies, about how trauma affects them, about how trauma is passed down through generations, multiple generations, and about how resilience and trauma interact. The author says that the same bodily forces that make us resilient, for example, the fight response or the flee response, can also encourage us to harm one another. And so much of the key of leaning into the people that God wants us to be is dealing with this bodily trauma that we have inherited. So many of our efforts to address inequity and violence and hatred have been conceptual, right? They've been intellectual. And in large part, they have failed. And so what this book asserts is that if we're going to make any progress, we need to start with our bodies. And I think Paul would agree. I think that this is this book is not a Christian book per se, but I think this is a spiritual practice, this is a spiritual concept of healing and caring for our own bodies. And Resmaa Menakem, the author of this book, says that this is not just true of Black bodies. He's a Black man and he talks about his family, but he says that this inherited trauma is not just true of Black or brown bodies. If you study the history of Europe during the Middle Ages, you will see the same cruelty that powerful white bodies did to less powerful white bodies over many hundreds of years. And this created deep trauma in the bodies of white people. And then some of these bodies came to the quote unquote new world, right? And they brought with them this trauma and these cruel practices. And through their own trauma, they then hurt and traumatized other people. And so today, as Americans, no matter what race we are, we have great resilience, but we also continue to carry trauma in our bodies. And true holiness means taking care of our bodies. It means doing things like drinking enough water, getting enough sleep, going to therapy, taking medication if you need it, limiting our alcohol and our drug intake, all of those things that we do to care for our physical bodies that God have given us. That is holy work. That is holiness. The Bible says that we are embodied creatures. We are spirits and souls with bodies, and that our bodies are temples. We can worship God through our bodies, through taking care of our bodies and through healing our bodies of some of the trauma that we have inherited. And this idea of us being embodied creatures is really what this holiness pathway is all about. Paul would not have known to put it in these terms 2,000 plus years ago. They didn't talk about trauma in the same way when the New Testament was being written. But I actually think that this is exactly what Paul was talking about when he says that we need to offer our bodies first. We need to sacrifice our bodies, offer our bodies, and make them holy. Give our bodies over to God to be healed and to be transformed. Not to conform to the world, but to be transformed through a process of holiness in Christ. You know, so much of Western Christianity, which is the way that most of us have experienced God and have experienced Jesus, so much of Western Christianity heavily focuses on Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection. And ultimately, this is transactional. And when we focus on the end of Jesus' life, on the death and the resurrection, individualism becomes elevated, right? So it's about what Jesus has done for me so that I can get into heaven, right? I'm sure many of you grew up hearing like, Jesus died for me. Jesus died for my sins. And so it's both transactional and very individualistic. It's about what Jesus has done for me so that I can go to heaven, so that I can be with Christ for eternity. And in the process of elevating the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, we have ignored and we, meaning I think the Western church, have ignored other really important aspects of Jesus's life, particularly his incarnation. And like I said, I'm going a little into the incarnational pathway today. I'm not sure who's preaching next week. Hopefully I'm not stealing your sermon. But I think that these two things are really related. I think that we have sometimes overlooked the bodily piece of Jesus Christ and the incarnation, the idea that God made God's self human into a human body with pain, with trauma, a body that needed to drink enough water and get enough sleep and all of that kind of stuff. So much of our theology centers, and again, not our Riverfront but like our Western Christian theology, centers on the crucifixion and atonement and the cross. And very little attention often is given to the incarnation. And this is because, according to much of Western theology, atonement, so the idea that Jesus died for my sins, and there's this transaction, like Jesus died and now I can be forgiven, it has direct implications on our personal salvation. So it makes the incarnation insignificant in comparison to where we are going to spend eternity. But the Eastern Church and indigenous cultures, in contrast, have a far better grasp on the significance of the incarnation of Christ. Their reverence for creation and for the Creator provides the basis for this predisposition, whereas the Western Church has focused on salvation and is focused on getting souls into heaven and often neglected the physical incarnation. I actually believe that Paul and the other writers of the New Testament prioritized a theology of the incarnation to form the basis of their theology. Paul uses the Greek word kenosis, which means to self-empty. And this idea of self-emptying, or laying yourself on the altar, like in the passage we just read, is a central idea that formed his theology around the nature of a creator God, a God who created a physical world and physical bodies, and then created one body for himself to dwell in, for herself to dwell in. From a God who self-emptied her own power to become powerless. And I think we desperately need a more embodied Christianity to form the basis of our belief system. The bodily incarnation is so central to our faith. The idea that God lives in people. God lives in people. And God became a person in the person of Jesus. Without a healthy theology of incarnation and of the body, it's easy to just become focused on the next life, on eternity, while overlooking the justice work that needs to happen in the here and in the now, in this embodied world. Christ invites us to pick up our cross and follow him through kenosis, through self-emptying. This is the nature of Creator God, who self-emptied himself to make herself powerless in the person of Jesus Christ. And this kenosis, self-emptying, is the way towards healing, and it is the way towards universal reconciliation of all creatures, of all things. All right, so I want to pause and get really practical for a minute. I was debating about whether to do this at the end or in the middle of my sermon. I'm going to do it in the middle of my sermon. I want to give you a couple exercises that you can do to get back into your body when you feel like you are outside of it. A lot of times we are disembodied. We feel like our soul and our bodies are disconnected. And so I want to give you a couple exercises. These are taken from the book, My Grandmother's Hands, that I told you I'm on a kick with right now, that can help us get back into our physical bodies. Because I believe that doing some of these practices is a holy work that we can do. So I'm gonna do a couple of these. If you're with kids and it's crazy in your house, maybe you can listen to this sermon later and do it. But if you're one of the lucky few who has a quiet house, you can feel free to just make yourself comfortable. Take a few cleansing breaths. If you want to turn off your camera, you can turn off your camera so people aren't looking at you. And I'm just going to lead us in a couple of these exercises to just be really aware of our bodies. And then we'll continue with the rest of the sermon. Okay, so first, we're going to check our body's checkpoints. So each of our bodies has internal checkpoints, physical sensations that activate when something feels unfair or frightening or dangerous or otherwise not right. And these are signals from your soul nerve. They might alert you to something real, something perceived, something possible, or something imagined. To your body, these are all identical. These signals might include a tingle at the back of your neck, a sinking feeling in your belly, a tightness in your shoulders, or some other unpleasant sensation. You'll know these sensations when you experience them. These checkpoints are your body's early warning signals. They alert you when you are headed for a fight, flee, or freeze response. If you're paying attention, when one of these signals goes off, you can stop what you're doing and take steps to settle your body. This helps you avoid fight, flee, or freeze response. It also gives you a chance to change the dynamic of the situation by leaving it, stepping back, or saying something like, you know what? I'd like to do this differently. Whenever one of your body's checkpoints signals you, investigate it. What do you experience? Where do you experience it? What emotions, thoughts, or images are arising with it? Then ask yourself, what is this sensation telling me? What is it urging me to do? What movements do I need to make? What actions need to be completed? How can I respond from my deepest integrity, the best parts of myself? The answer to this last question will point a way forward. With practice, you'll get more familiar with your body's checkpoints. Over time, you'll learn to recognize each signal as soon as it activates, and you'll know what it's telling you. And I'm going to do one more, so you can keep your eyes closed if you would like, and just kind of sit comfortably in your chair, close your eyes, take a few deep breaths. Imagine you're floating in space. Below you, planet Earth turns slowly. Watch it for a few seconds. Slowly descend until the part of the country that you're in fills your field of vision. Stay directly above it like a GPS satellite so that it doesn't move beneath you. Keep descending until you're looking down on whatever city or town or other area your body is sitting in right now. Continue your descent until you're looking down at the top of the building you're in. Descend far enough down that you can see your own body below, as if you are viewing it from a helicopter. Keep dropping slowly and steadily until you can see your own body in detail, as if you're about 10 feet above it. Observe your body's posture, any movements it makes, and the clothing it's wearing. Slowly and smoothly descend the rest of the way and slip inside your body. For a few breaths, simply be aware of being in your body. Relax and let the chair or the couch support you. Then notice the sensation of the chair against your legs and thighs, and notice how it feels against your back. Open your eyes. Reorient yourself by looking around you, including behind you. Return to the here and now. I feel relaxed just reading that to you guys. So you can feel free to open your eyes now. Turn your cameras back on if you want. Those are just a couple ways, a couple practices, a couple exercises to get us back into our bodies. This is spiritual work. This is holy work. And I invite you to try some of those, a couple of those, thinking about your body's triggers and thinking about ways to kind of get back into your body when you have particular moments of stress or tension. This is the holiness that we're talking about. You know, as we yield ourselves to God's will and to God's plan, we commit to not conforming to the pattern of this world, like it says in Romans, but to being transformed, like Paul says, from the inside out. That is how we are transformed, from the inside out. It's through our bodies, through our physical bodies, that we experience this transformation. Paul goes on in this passage we read in Romans to describe specifically what some of this transformation looks like. He says, we will share with those in need. We will be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. We will rejoice with those who rejoice. We will mourn with those who mourn. We will not be proud, but we will be willing to associate with people of low position. We will not think we are superior. Where else have you heard similar teaching? From the mouth of Jesus, right? Specifically in Matthews 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew talks exactly about these exact same things. And Paul takes it a step further to broaden the community to people outside of the faith. He's talking about how to relate to people outside of our tribe, people that we might think of as different or even as enemies. He's talking about how we can live at peace with everyone. So really, he's talking about collective liberation, if we want to put it in modern terms, but the idea of seeing the humanity in everyone, the idea of healing from our generational trauma, and healing from the various forms of supremacy that we have all experienced and inherited in our bodies. He says in this passage, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And in doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. You know, this passage is a little confusing because it sounds like something you wouldn't probably want, burning coals on top of your head. But in the ancient world, individuals needed to keep their fire going all the time in order to ensure that there would be fire for cooking and for warmth. But if your fire went out, you would have to go visit your neighbor to get some live coals to bring back to your house and to start your fire again. And people would carry a container on their heads, and they'd go ask their neighbor for some live coals to get their fire started again. And so their neighbor would heap burning coals on their head when the other neighbor had need, and then that neighbor would carry it back to their house and start their fire again. So this image, though it doesn't relate to our daily lives living in the 21st century, is a clear picture of what it means to live a life with a transformed center, a life of holiness. Not only should you show a sign of respect if your enemy comes to you, but you're supposed to go an extra mile to extend hospitality and take what you have and give to them to meet their needs. The self-emptying, right? The kenosis. And when we think about what enemy would have meant to Paul's audience, really, it would have just meant somebody outside of your tribe, somebody outside of your in-group. It's an image of really seeing the humanity in every single person, seeking collective liberation. And we're only able to do this. We are only able to do this holy work if we heal our own bodies, if we crawl up on that altar that Paul is talking about and self-empty, yield ourselves to God and ask for God to have a transformation within us so that we can become more and more like Jesus. Resmamanakam refers to clean pain and dirty pain. And dirty pain is pain that is pushed down, not able to be seen, and therefore not able to be metabolized. It hurts others, and it moves us further away from God as we harm God's creatures. Clean pain is seen, understood, and worked with. It's still painful. It still hurts, but it's seen, understood, and worked with in order to heal and release. And this transformation of our pain from dirty pain to clean pain is the active work that we must do in our bodies to become holy, to become like Jesus. But healing from our own bodily trauma is not something that we do on our own, and it is not something that we do with our own strength and our own power. We can't will ourselves through pain and through trauma. It is something we do with God. It is recognizing the ways that we are being pushed from various angles to fit in a certain mold, and then seeking God to help us break out of this mold and begin to be molded into the new mold that is created to us by God. The new wineskin, right? A mold that is meant to reshape us and reform us so that we look and we act and we think and we breathe and we love more like Jesus. It's being able to look at each other, at our enemies, as people outside of our tribe, and say, you are holy. And I see Jesus at work in you and through you, in your body, in my body, through your body, through my body. May we continue to remember that, like it says in Philippians, he who began a great work within us will continue it on to the day of completion. God is constantly doing that work within us, in our bodies. And may we continue to empty ourselves of our dirty pain, of our trauma, as we lay ourselves down on the altar, healing our God-given bodies as we worship an incarnational God who had a traumatized body just like ours. Amen. Go in peace, brothers and sisters.